First, you're going to load the character that you want to create a garment for. For the purpose of this video, I'm going to remove all textures. Next, you're going to delete any objects that are attached to your figure. Then you file export as an OBJ using these settings. Next, we're going to import the figure into Marvelous Designer. You're going to import it as an avatar. Then we're going to add the sloper project that you downloaded, or you can use your own. So we're going to add a garment. Now we're going to save our project as Collarless Casual Shirt. The project we're going to do here comes from this book, Pattern Making for Menswear. The great thing about using a sloper is you can use the same formula from any pattern and apply it to your sloper. So whether you're using Victoria 9 or Michael 8, it's the same process. We're going to shape the body, lower the neckline, create this front placket. We're going to shape this hemline, shorten the sleeve cap length, and then shape the sleeve. What's great about this book is that it gives you all the steps, walks you through all the instructions going from your sloper to the final product. And these are all graded, so they go from easy to difficult. Next thing we're going to do is move this dart for Victoria 9. If you are doing this pattern using the Michael 8 sloper, you do not need to do this. So what I want to do is move this dart to the side. So I'm going to hold down the G key, create an internal line, and cut and sew. Then I'm going to hit the B key to edit sewing and merge those two top pieces. So we have moved the dart to the side now. If we simulate, you're going to see nothing much really happened by moving the dart. But to prepare for this particular pattern, what I am going to do is rotate the left seam and armhole on the front. Go into the Transform Point Segment tool. And I only want to manipulate these two segments. I'm going to double click to activate the pivot. And I'm just going to slightly turn these. And this is going to move the top of the shoulder over, which will help with a more casual fit. Then I'll simulate, and now I'm going to line up these points so that they're all straight. The last thing I'm going to do is confirm that this seam line is the same length as the new segments I've created. So this seam line is 8.9, and the two of these together are 8.786. So I'm going to change this to, I'm going to change this line to match the two segments together. And the last thing I'm going to do is delete the existing sewing, because when you move segments around, there will be some slight changes in the ratio of how the free sewing tool will allocate the sewing. So moving forward, the rest of the changes to the sloper apply to both this V9 pattern and the Michael 8 pattern, and I will continue on with Michael 8. So we're going to continue on with Michael 8 just because it's a little easier to see what's going on without the extra volume in the chest. So the first thing I'm going to do is I am going to move the pants pieces down, and I'm going to change the level. As we begin simulating, the shirt is going to go over the pants, so I'm going to change the layer of the pants to -1 so that the shirt always simulates over the pants. So I want to now begin to identify the hemline. So for these two lines, I'm shift clicking and selecting the lines. I'm going to offset as a pattern outline. I'm going to create an internal line, and I'm going to offset as 6 inches. When you use the offset pattern tool, it does not sew those pieces, so we'll have to manually sew them. So I'm going to undock the sewing tool and go into the segment sewing tool, and I'm going to simulate first just so I can see what's going on. And now I'm going to sew those segments together. Because we have symmetric sewing on, this one is already there, so now I'm going to go from here back to here, and I'm going to simulate again. So now what we want to do is create more of a silhouette, more of a shape here in the torso area. So I am going to highlight these points and move them in a little to begin creating a more sculptured look. Same with those pieces. Then I'm going to use the C tool on this line and create a curve so that we get a slimmer, more trim fit. To do a double check, I'm going to hit Shift-I to hide the internal lines, and we'll get a better sense of where we are with the shirt, and already we're getting a more interesting silhouette. Now we're going to come back and check these seam lines to make sure they're still. So this is 11.6.2. This line is 11.62. I'm going to change the length of this line to 11.62. Notice it's going up. I want it to go down. So what I want to make sure is that now these two lines match and these two lines match. So when I move that down, this became 5.9. This changed, so I'm going to change this line to 6 and simulate. And save the project. So now I'm going to shape the hemline. I'm going to go into the Edit Pattern tool, Z, select the first pattern line segment, and I'm going to click right and split into 3 segments. Then I'm going to do the same thing with this line. And what I want to do is make the front and back of the hem just slightly longer than the sides. So to do that, I'm going to highlight this segment here. These two segments match each other on the front and back, and I'm going to hit the up arrow key to move them the same length, and I'm going to do the same thing with this segment, only this time I'm going to hit the down arrow key to move them to begin getting a little more length in the front and back. Then I'm going to go into the smooth curve and smooth these segments out. and then simulate. And now we have that shaped hemline with a little more length in the front and back. And in the front, I might do just a little bit more here. So now we have a shaped hemline with a little more length in the front and back. And sometimes when you're viewing it at this point, it doesn't seem like a big deal, but as we begin adding detail, you'll begin to see the impact of these small changes. Now I want to shape this collar to give it a more informal line. To do that, I'm going to first off trim off a little off the top. This line is set up for a dress, more formal shirt. I want to make this more casual, so I'm going to offset as internal line, and I'm going to cut off a 1/2 inch, and I'm going to do the same on the back. Then I'm going to cut these lines. Then, the reason why I'm not using the usual cut and sew is I'm just going to go ahead and delete these extra fabric pieces just to give me a more casual line. The other thing we're going to do to make this more casual is we're going to lower the neckline. We're going to lower the front of the collar a little, so I'm hitting the Z key, highlighting these points, and I'm just going to drag them down. And this will give us a slightly more casual collar. Whenever we do this, we want to check the shape of the collar, so I'm going to click Z, Edit Pattern. I'm going to highlight this line first, and then holding down the Shift key, highlight this line, and I'm going to match up to Start. And this gives us an idea of what the shape of the collar looks like. And so I want to give this a slightly more circular feel. So I'm using the C key just to readjust those curves. And when you start getting slight bumps in your curves, I will sometimes delete all the curve points and just reshape the curve. So what we want to get is a more circular cut. And if you notice this, it's not unusual when you cut a pattern, you might get some inconsistencies. Notice here, when we cut the back part, it made this top shoulder seam uneven. So we're going to check the length of the front seam, which is 5.473, and I'm going to change the length of the back shoulder top to 5.473. And now they match up again. When you do that, you still want to check your sewing to make sure. Notice here the line is not actually coming to the end, so you want to make sure you check your sewing. So when you make cuts, go ahead and examine your seams to make sure they're still doing what you want them to do. So now I'm going to move this pattern piece back into place, and to make sure it's perpendicular, I'm going to rotate on the x-axis based on that line, just so that I make sure it's straight up and down. Now I'm going to simulate, and now we have a more relaxed casual collar. Now we're going to shape the sleeve. We're going to do a couple of things. We're going to taper the sides, we're going to shape the bottom, but before we do that, what we're going to do is we're going to give our armhole a little more room. A common silhouette in casual shirts is to have a little more room within the armhole. So I'm going to highlight these 2 points, and I'm using the down arrow key to move them down. I'm not doing it a lot, and notice I'm doing them together, the front and back piece. And then what I'm going to do is check my lengths, because when I move those down, the length of my armhole changed to 18.116. So now I need to check the length of the sleeve cap, which is 17. So now, which is 17.6. So now I need to increase the size of this cap. Now I need to modify this cap, and I'm going to use the transform point segment tool to do that. I'm going to double click the middle point to let it know that I'm pivoting from there, and I'm going to make the sleeve cap a little wider, which is a more casual cut. So we're at 18.388. And it's not unusual for there to be a little extra room with the sleeve cap, so let's simulate to see where we're at. So as you can see, it just gives it a little more room. But now I want to take care of some of the bagginess here, so I'm going to delete this line, and I'm going to shape these lines using the C key. And now we're getting a bit more of the silhouette that we would expect. And we're going to finish up shaping the hem here. We're going to make the sleeve slightly longer. I'm using the down arrow key to move the sleeve line down. I'm going to split the line into 2 segments. And then I'm going to use the C key to move the front up a little and curve the back down a little. Then I'm going to simulate, and now we're beginning to see silhouette that I want. Next, I want to create the placket. Before I do that, however, I'm going to delete these waistlines. We don't really need them anymore. And I'm going to delete this point. Since that's on a straight line, I can delete it, but this point I'm going to convert to a curve point, so I keep that curve. Same thing with this point. And then last off, I'm going to delete that point since I have a straight line. To create the placket, I'm going to create some guidelines. So first off, I'm going to create a horizontal guideline. And then I'm going to create a vertical one. To create the vertical one, I'm going to offset as an internal line and offset 0.5 inches. And this gives us the outline of the placket. In order to cut it, what we're going to have to do is add a point to the intersection. We're going to divide those lines. Then we're going to delete the other guides so that just the placket remains. And for these 2 lines, we're going to have to join intersecting overlapping points so that we'll be able to cut this from the pattern. So now we're ready to cut and sew, and now we have the placket, the outline of the placket. I'm going to hit B to join these 2. I'm going to merge those 2 pieces, and then I'm going to delete this point. I'm going to keep this one because we need these bottom lines to sew. So now with the placket, there's 2 pieces to it. One that is underneath with the button, and the other which is over it with the buttonholes. So the first one I'm going to create is underneath, and on a male it goes on the right. If you're doing it for Victoria 9, reverse this process. So I'm going to copy this and paste it up here for now. So this is the part that will be underneath. So I'm going to do a couple of things. I'm going to change the particle distance to 6. With smaller pattern pieces, it's good to have a different particle distance, and you can have different particle distance for different pattern pieces. This can remain at 8, but I'm going to put this at 6 and that at 6. And this one right here, I'm going to put on layer -1 so that the layer with the buttons will go underneath, and this one with layer 0, it will go on top of it. Then I'm going to do some segment sewing. So this is the one underneath. What I'm going to do is delete the sewing on the right, and then I'm going to do a segment sewing. I'm going to sew this to the left and these two small pattern pieces to the shirt. So now if we examine, this is the one that's going to go on top, and this is the one that's going to go on the bottom. And now I'm going to simulate. That finishes up the placket for the shirt. Now we're going to continue with some additional final shaping. I'm hitting Shift S. Because we still have this seam in the front, we need to get rid of that. So I'm going to merge these seams. Now I'm going to move this bottom piece out of the way and line this piece up. I am going to merge these pieces. I'm going to begin prepping the pattern for the UV layout, but there are a couple things I want to do. I actually do want a little more length on the sleeve, so I'm going to highlight these points. So I hit Z for edit pattern, highlight those points, and hit the down arrow key to move them down. And now I'm going to hit S for simulate. So now I'm beginning to get the final shape and silhouette that I want for this shirt. Some nice curves there. The sleeve is fitting nicely. A little extra room under the arm. We've got the placket. Now we're going to do a little cleanup of this bottom hem. I'm going to highlight these points and convert them to curve points. Now since I'm happy with the shape, I can get rid of those extra points. It'll make the pattern cleaner. So I'm converting them all to curve points. And now I'm going to save the project. And now, next we're going to begin doing some detailing work. A good practice is to save a backup copy. Because we'll be making a lot of cuts and a lot of changes to add in detailing. And now if we notice we're on the backup copy, we're going to bring back our recent version so that we continue working on the original. Now as we move into the final stretch of completing the garment, let's look at our fabrics. This fabric I'm going to call shirt, and I'm going to make a copy of it. I'm going to create two additional fabrics, one for trim and one for seams. And this trim fabric, just so that we can see it for now, I'm going to change the color. And I'm going to do the same with seams, just so that we can see the difference. What we're going to begin doing now is adding trim to the garment. I'm going to go into my edit pattern, highlight this line, and I'm going to offset as an internal line 0.5 inches. And then I'm going to cut and sew, and I'm going to apply the trim to those pieces. Because these are small pattern pieces, I'm going to change the particle distance to 5. That will give us some finer detail. And the other thing I'm going to add some additional thickness. So if we go into thick view, you're going to see some additional thickness there. And if you go into this line right here, we also want to make sure that this line is marked with curved side geometry, so that in DAZ, if you apply a sub D modifier, these additional curved lines will help the mesh keep its shape. So I'm going to move this pattern piece back, and I'm going to do the same here. I'm going to offset as an internal line 0.5. I'm going to cut and sew, and I'm going to do the same thing to that small pattern piece. I'm going to add the trim, and then I'm going to add some additional thickness. And for this top placket piece, I am going to apply some additional thickness, but only one, just so that it stands out a little more on the shirt. And I want this to all appear as one piece, so what I'm going to do is merge these pieces. So now I'm going to add trim to the back and do the same steps. I'm going to offset as an internal line at 0.5. For this one, I'm going to do a little check here. If you notice, that's not really matching up the other trim piece. So I'm going to move this point in a little so that they match up better. And then I'm going to cut and sew again. But before I do this, I want to point out a setting and preference that might be handy for your workflow. Under 2D, there's a setting called Automatically Offset 2D Pattern When Cut. I have mine off so that when I cut a pattern piece, it stays in place and it doesn't offset from what I cut it from. So I'm going to go ahead and cut and sew. I'm going to apply the trim, add additional thickness, and then I'm going to do the same for the sleeves. Then I'm going to change my particle distance to 5, add additional thickness, and I'm going to apply the trim pattern to that, and I'm going to double check. I don't remember changing the particle distance. I don't think I did that on the back pieces. Next, we're going to add in our seams and hems and our buttons, and we'll be done. So first off, I'm going to add a hem to the shirt. So we're going to offset as an internal line, again 0.5. And then we're going to cut and sew. I can keep the particle distance here at 8 because I want it to merge with the above shirt. But I am going to add some thickness to it so that when we go to render, the hem will have a little bit of thickness. But here I'm going to assign it the seams pattern, the seams fabric, and you'll see why when we get to DAZ. So for now, I'm going to add the seams fabric, and I'm going to add just a little bit of thickness of 1. And I'm going to do the same thing around the armholes. I'm going to offset as an internal line, but here I'm only going to do 0.25. This is going to be a seam. I want to add some thickness for the seam, and I'm going to do the same here. And when you add these, you'll sometimes see you get some additional points. Hold down the Shift key and convert those to curve points. And I'm going to do the same thing over here. I'm going to convert to curve points so that we have a single line. So we're going to cut and sew, and we're going to add an additional thickness of 1. So now you're beginning to see why I'm doing this. This will give our garment a little more realism. Most garments where they meet and they have seams, they have a little bit of thickness. And you'll see how we handle this in DAS as well. This will give more realism to the garment. So I'm going to apply the seams fabric to those pieces. Then I'm going to do the same on the back. Cut and sew. Apply additional thickness. Then I'm going to apply a particle distance of 5 to those small pieces. Then on these new pieces, I'm going to apply the seams. And so what we're doing is we're building out some additional thickness to give realism to the garment when we go to render. Now I'm going to do the same with the top seam on the back. We only need to do it on the back. We don't need to do it on the front. Offset as an internal line. And with all these cuts, this is why you want to make sure you have all your shaping done before you start your detailing. Okay, we just have to do the sleeves. And again, when I add that color in, I'm going to take it out when we go to export, but when I add that color in so that I can make sure I'm capturing all the seams, and we just got to do the sides now. And I normally do them on the back. Last off, I want to add one more detail. I'm going to take these major pattern pieces and I'm going to change them to double-sided. You'll see why we do this when we get to DAS. So these 4 pieces, the sleeve, the 2 sleeve pieces, the back and the front, I'm going to change those to double-sided. And for the shirt, I'm going to make an adjustment where it says back, where it says use same material as front. I'm going to uncheck that. I'm going to save the project. We're almost there. We just have to do stitching and buttons. So now let's add some stitching, but before we do, let's go to the top stitch window. We can use the default. The main thing we want to check on is the type should be texture, and the offset should be 0.1, and our color is going to be black. And then we can begin adding stitching to the pattern. If you notice, sometimes it's hard to pick the right segment when they're up against each other, so sometimes you need to move a pattern piece so you can get to it. So I am adding top stitching to all pieces. And as we do this, I also notice I never did add a hemline to the back piece, so I'm going to do that. So offset as an internal line. Our hem was at 0.5. I'm going to cut and sew, and the hem I gave an additional thickness of 1. We're going to go back to our fabric, change that to seams. So now let's continue on with our segment top stitch. So as we get down here to the sleeve, you're going to notice it did a interesting thing with the curve. We don't want to extend the stitching when you have a curve like that. And you're going to go ahead and add top stitching wherever you want it in your pattern. And here I'm going to have to move this piece out of the way so I can get some top stitching on the placket. So now I've added in all the top stitching, so I'm going to save the project. Almost there. Next, we're going to add buttons. So we're going to go into the button tool. The button is going to go on this bottom piece. So that's this piece here. So I'm going to click where I want the button. I'm going to go ahead and select this button and move it up a bit. And I'm also going to go into the button panel and check out the properties for this button. I don't like how thick it is, I don't like how wide it is. I'm going to change the width to 0.5 and I'm going to change the thickness to 1. And then I'm going to select, so there's two pieces here. One is the properties for the button, and then the other is the properties for this one particular button. And I'm going to, for now, turn off collision until I've got them in place. Click right to copy, and we're going to paste, and I'm going to hold down the control key and click right to paste, and it'll allow me to add two buttons at once, and I can check the spacing. So that looks good. So I'm going to simulate. I want to make sure that these two this pattern piece is lined up with the placket in the pattern. And the reason why I'm doing that is I'm going to copy these buttons and I'm going to paste them in this pattern piece, and by holding down the shift I can make sure the buttons are aligned, and then I can click each one of these buttons and I can convert to a buttonhole. Now if you notice, these buttonholes are awful thick, so I'm going to go into the buttonhole panel, I'm going to select the button, and I'm going to change the width to 0.6, and I'm also going to change the color to gray. And now I'm going to do one last thing. I'm going to fasten the bottom button to the bottom buttonhole. Press Q to get back. And now I got to go back to this button and tell it to collide. The reason why I tell these two not to collide is it will cause problems with the simulation, but if you want to use a button with a buttonhole, you have to have collision on. I'm going to hit space, and now you can see. And now what I can do is grab this pattern piece and it takes a little doing, but I'm just going to go ahead and fold it down so that I have again the silhouette that I want with this open collar. Now we're going to set up UVs. I'm going to move this piece back in place now since I have the buttons set up, and I'm going to go into the UV editor. I'm going to reset UV to 2D arrangement. I'm going to move the pans. I'm going to fit the pans to UV01 and then move them over. Then I'm going to fit the shirt to UV01, and I'm going to move the buttons back onto the shirt, and I'm going to move the buttons back onto the shirt UV tile. So now the UVs are set up. Next we need to create the stitches map for use in DAZ. Last thing we need to do before we export is create a mask so that we can display the stitching in DAZ. But before we do that, we need to make one final adjustment on the stitchings property. Select the top stitch panel and go into the property editor. Under configuration, change the faces to display the stitches on to both. The concept for the next couple of things we need to do is straightforward. We need to reverse the colors on this garment so that it's white on black. So I'm going to go to each fabric and change the color to black. Then I'm going to go to the top stitch panel and change the color of the stitching to white. This will create a mask that we can use in DAZ to display the stitches and the buttonholes. I'm going to do this for each fabric. If you remember, we set up our shirt fabric to display on front and back, so I need to change the back fabric color to black as well. So when you're done, your garment should look like this. It should show all stitching in white on a black background. Okay, now we're ready to export the garment to DAZ. Before I export, I always double check my top stitch to make sure it is set to texture. And then I'm going to do a file, export OBJ. I'm going to export the thick version of it along with this diffuse map. This diffuse map will have the texture for stitching. And I export it at 4096 pixels. Now we're ready to head into DAZ. Now we will import the garment into DAZ. Now we will apply a sub-D modifier. As you can see, we get a few artifacts, but they are minimal, and you can decide if you want to fix them in post or go back to Marvelous Designer and try to create more geometry to minimize them. So now let's take a look at what surfaces came over from Marvelous Designer. Let me quickly show you the HDR I'm going to be using to render these images. It's a free studio HDR that's available at the link in the description below. When texturing fabric in DAZ, I like to use a studio HDR and not an outdoor or sky environment. So now let's put that texture that we created in Marvelous Designer to work. I'm going to highlight all my surfaces and, to begin with, put it in the bump channel so that we can see how it works. I'm going to change the strength of the map to 5, and I don't know if you'll be able to see it in this video, but you are beginning to see the map give definition to where the stitching should be. Next, I'm going to use that exact same map in the diffuse overlay channel. To better demonstrate what I'm doing, I'm going to change the diffuse overlay color to red, and then I'm going to put that same map that we just used in the diffuse overlay weight channel. Now you can see how that map can begin to show the stitching on your garment. It's not meant to be drastic, it's meant to be subtle. Also, the effects in the photoreal final are better than the interactive mode here. Now I'm going to demonstrate how you can kit bash with your favorite shaders still using this technique. First, I'm going to change the shader for the button. Then I'm going to apply my favorite cotton white texture to the shirt material. A couple of things to fix here. The normal map is a little harsh. I'm going to apply a tiling of 5, and when I do that, I have to reverse out that tiling in my diffuse overlay map by changing the tiling, dividing 1 by 5, my tile amount, to give me 0.2 for this situation, so that the diffuse overlay map tiling now matches the tiling of the rest of the texture maps. I want to tweak the color of this map, and I'm going to show you a few other details that you can add for further realism. The reason why I had you set up 2 separate materials for the front and back of the shirt is I like to take the back material, change the transparency amount to 0, and then lightly change the transparency amount of the top shirt material so that it appears that there's less fabric where the top material is than where the seams and the trim are. So there is no one thing you can do for realistic fabric. It will always be a combination of a number of subtle changes. Adding the stitching in, changing opacity for different parts of the garment, keeping the seams thick with a little more fabric, so all can add to the illusion of realism. These are the simple things you can do within DAZ Studio itself. In another video, I will look at using Substance Painter to create more realistic fabrics using an external program.